It was a warm evening in the heart of downtown Arlington. The streets were alive with the hum of conversation, the sound of footsteps on the pavement, and the steady flow of people as they came and went from cafes, shops, and restaurants. Elijah Grant, a Navy SEAL with a distinguished record, was enjoying his leave. He walked leisurely along the sidewalk, dressed in a simple gray t-shirt, a pair of well-fitted jeans, and sneakers that cushioned each step. Over his shoulder, he carried a leather messenger bag, a symbol of a man with purpose and simplicity. He was headed to a local bookstore, a place he'd been meaning to visit for months. For the first time in what felt like forever, his mind felt at ease, free from the demands of his profession. But as he crossed an intersection, the piercing wail of a police siren snapped him out of his thoughts. Tires screeched as the police car came to a halt nearby. The door opened with a creak, and out stepped Officer Cardin, a white officer whose sharp blue eyes scanned Elijah's every move with unnerving precision. There was a coldness in his gaze, like a hawk sizing up its prey. "Hey, you!" Officer Cardin barked, his voice cutting through the noise of the street like a knife. Elijah halted mid-step, turning to face the officer, his eyes meeting Cardin's without hesitation. "You're in a hurry, aren't you?" Cardin asked, his voice dripping with suspicion, as though he had already decided something was off. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" The question hung between them, charged with an accusation that hadn't been voiced yet. Elijah remained calm, unfazed by the officer's tone. A few pedestrians slowed their pace, sensing the tension in the air, but most continued on as if this sort of thing happened every day. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Just heading to the bookstore," he replied, his voice even. Cardin folded his arms, a smirk playing on his lips. "A bookstore, huh?" he said, glancing at Elijah's bag. "What's in that bag?" "Carrying anything I should know about." The implication was clear. He wasn't asking out of curiosity, but with the intention of finding something to justify his suspicion. Elijah felt the weight of the gazes around him, the subtle murmurs of the crowd that had started to gather. He could already sense the underlying prejudice, the judgment in the officer's words, but instead of letting it anger him, something inside Elijah shifted. A quiet confidence flickered in his dark eyes, unshaken, unyielding. "You want to check?" Elijah asked, his voice steady, almost daring Cardin to make a move. The officer straightened, clearly taken aback by the calm challenge in Elijah's response. "I'll be the one asking the questions," Cardin snapped, the authority in his voice suddenly forced, as if he was trying to reassert control over the situation. A brief silence followed, and the officer's hand hovered near his utility belt, ready to pull out his weapon if needed. Meanwhile, the crowd had thickened, more phones coming out, discreetly capturing every moment. Elijah remained still, his body relaxed but his presence demanding attention. Something about the way he stood made Cardin pause. "All right, officer," Elijah spoke again, his tone still as calm as ever. "Let's do this the right way." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, their curiosity piqued by the mounting tension. Elijah's demeanor, unwavering in the face of the officer's implicit threat, seemed to make Cardin hesitate even further. The officer squared his shoulders, taking a step closer, boots clinking against the pavement. "Drop the bag," he demanded, his voice now harsher, as though raising it might help mask his uncertainty. Elijah didn't move. His expression remained unreadable. "Sure," he replied after a moment, carefully removing the bag from his shoulder and holding it out to the officer. His calmness wasn't submission, it was calculated strategy. As Cardin snatched the bag, Elijah's gaze remained fixed on him, unblinking. There was no fear in those eyes, only a quiet strength that unsettled the officer. "Hands behind your back," Cardin barked, reaching for the cuffs at his belt. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Am I under arrest?" His voice was steady, almost challenging. "You're being detained," Cardin shot back, avoiding the question altogether. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." The absurdity of the claim hung in the air like a bad joke. A few in the crowd exchanged incredulous glances, and a woman holding her phone muttered, "Here we go again." Elijah gave a slow nod, a slight, almost imperceptible smile curling at the corners of his lips. "All right, Officer Carden," Elijah said, stepping a bit closer, but keeping his movements deliberate. "Let me help you out." Carden stiffened, his hand instinctively hovering near his holstered weapon. "Stay right there," he ordered. But Elijah raised his hands slightly, signaling for the officer to relax. "I'm just giving you my ID," Elijah said calmly, his movements slow and controlled. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a sleek card holder. From it, he extracted his military ID and handed it over. Carden hesitated for a moment, glancing at the card. His smirk faltered for just a second as his eyes scanned the name, the rank, and the words United States Navy SEAL etched into the ID. "You still think I fit the description?" Elijah asked, his voice as calm as ever, but now carrying a faint edge of amusement. The crowd, sensing a shift, leaned in, phones raised high. The tension in the air seemed to crackle with anticipation. Carden, clearly flustered, clenched his jaw and tossed the ID back at Elijah. "This doesn't mean you're above suspicion," he muttered, still trying to assert control. Elijah, his arms crossed and a faint smile playing on his lips, remained unfazed. His expression said everything without words. "Go ahead, dig yourself deeper." As Carden began rummaging through the bag, Elijah took a small step back, his demeanor now tinged with quiet confidence, almost theatrical in its calm. "Make sure to show everyone what you find," he said, gesturing toward the growing crowd. The tension had reached its peak. Carden crouched, pulling open the zipper of the leather messenger bag. The crowd leaned in closer, their phones trained on him like paparazzi awaiting a scandal. Inside, the contents were arranged neatly with military precision. A neatly folded book, a stainless steel water bottle, and a sleek black laptop. Carden hesitated, his fingers grazing the book before pulling it out. "What's this?" he demanded, holding up the book as though it were some kind of contraband. The title, Leadership Under Pressure, A SEAL's Guide to Resilience and Excellence, was emblazoned across the front. The irony wasn't lost on the crowd, but it clearly flew over Carden's head. Elijah's expression didn't change. "That's a book I wrote," he said evenly, the faintest hint of amusement coloring his words. Carden blinked, momentarily thrown off. "You wrote this?" he asked, as though the very idea were impossible. "That's what I said," Elijah replied, tilting his head slightly. "Want me to autograph it for you? Or are you just planning to keep rummaging through my things?" A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd, and Carden's face flushed red. He shoved the book back into the bag, his movements more forceful than necessary as he tried to regain control of the situation. "Cut the attitude," he snapped, his tone more defensive now. "This isn't over." Elijah raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, you're the one making a scene," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made it clear he wasn't intimidated. "I'm just trying to go about my day." Carden ignored the remark and continued rifling through the bag. He pulled out the laptop next, inspecting it as though expecting to find something incriminating. When that didn't pan out, he set it aside and moved to the last item, a small, leather-bound journal. He flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing as he read Elijah's precise handwriting detailing his thoughts and experiences from deployments overseas. One entry in particular caught Carden's eye. "You don't fight for recognition. You fight because it's the right thing to do. Leadership isn't about power, it's about service." Carden froze, clearly affected by the words, but he wasn't ready to admit it. The crowd, meanwhile, grew more restless. "Anything illegal in there, officer?" Elijah asked, his tone polite, yet laced with quiet challenge. Carden slammed the journal shut and shoved it back into the bag. His frustration was now evident. "You're free to go," he barked, stepping back as if to reclaim some semblance of authority. Elijah didn't move. He crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow, his voice low but commanding. "Not so fast," he said. "You stopped me, accused me of fitting a description, rifled through my personal belongings in front of all these people. I think we're owed an explanation." The crowd erupted into agreement, voices calling out, "What's the reason? And you can't just walk away from this." Phones were now pointed directly at Carden, their owners waiting for his next move. Carden shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado slipping under the weight of the crowd's scrutiny. Elijah stood tall, unflinching, his presence impossible to ignore. The officer's face twisted with frustration and unease as he glanced at the growing sea of phones. Elijah locked eyes with Carden, the silence stretching like a challenge. "You're not going to answer?" Elijah asked, his voice carrying easily over the murmurs of the crowd. "What's this description I supposedly fit?" Carden opened his mouth, but no words came out. The truth was glaringly obvious to everyone watching. There had never been a description. There had only been an excuse. "Let me guess," Elijah continued, his voice still calm but edged with sharpness. "A black man walking down the street, minding his own business. That about sums it up, doesn't it?" The crowd erupted, gasps and murmurs filling the air. Carden's jaw clenched, but he struggled to find a response. Elijah wasn't finished. "You see, officer," Elijah said, taking a step closer, his tone growing more pointed, "what you just did wasn't about keeping the streets safe. It was about power. You thought you could humiliate me, intimidate me, maybe even escalate this into something worse. But you didn't expect me to stay calm, did you?" Carden's face turned red, but he remained silent. "You didn't expect me to be a Navy SEAL," Elijah continued, his voice steady, yet piercing. "You didn't expect me to have the discipline to stay level-headed, or the experience to see right through your game." The crowd hung on every word. Some cheered softly. Others nodded in agreement. Elijah turned slightly, addressing the growing audience. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "It's about the countless times this happens to people who don't have a camera watching. People who don't have the training or the platform to push back. This isn't justice. It's harassment. And it needs to stop." The crowd responded with applause, their voices rising in support. Carden, now visibly rattled, tried to interject. I was just doing my job," he stammered, his earlier bravado completely gone. Elijah turned back to him, his expression one of quiet disappointment. "If this is how you define your job, maybe you're not cut out for it," he said simply. The words landed with the force of a slap, and the crowd roared in agreement. People began calling out phrases like, "hold him accountable," and "file a complaint." Carden looked around, his authority crumbling under the weight of public opinion. Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up. "Here's the deal, officer," he said. "You're going to stand here in front of all these people and explain why you stopped me." He let the implication hang in the air as he tapped his phone screen. Carden's eyes widened as he realized Elijah had been recording the entire interaction. The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You don't owe me an apology," Elijah added, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You owe every single person here an explanation for why you thought you could abuse your power. So go ahead. Talk." The crowd fell silent, waiting for Carden's response. The officer's face had drained of color, his earlier arrogance replaced by panic. He shifted from foot to foot, clearly searching for an escape. Carden stammered, his eyes darting between Elijah and the sea of phones recording every move. "I was acting on suspicion," he muttered, his words flimsy and unconvincing. "Just doing my duty, trying to ensure public safety." The crowd groaned in unison, disbelief rippling through the air. A man near the front shook his head. "Same old story," he muttered. A woman called out, "What suspicion? Say it plainly." Elijah's expression remained unchanged, but the weight of his presence grew more commanding. He took a deliberate step closer, his calm gaze locked onto Carden's flustered face. "Suspicion?" Elijah repeated, his voice cutting through the noise. "Let me make this clear, officer. Suspicion is not a license to harass. It's not an excuse to stop someone without cause, and it's certainly not justification for targeting someone because of the color of their skin." Carden opened his mouth to respond, but Elijah raised a hand, silencing him. The crowd cheered softly at the display of quiet authority. "You want to talk about suspicion?" Elijah continued, his tone rising slightly. What about the fact that you didn't ask anyone else on the street where they were going? What about the fact that you singled me out, rifled through my belongings, and tried to paint me as a threat? All without any evidence. Cardon's face turned bright red, his composure cracking under the intensity of Elijah's words. I wasn't singling you out, he sputtered, but his voice lacked any real conviction. Wink you. Elijah shot back, his calm demeanor now tinged with righteous indignation. Because I don't see anyone else here being stopped. Or are you going to tell us that they fit the same vague description you mentioned? The crowd erupted in support. Some shouted, "Answer him." Others called out, "We see right through you." Cardon looked like a cornered animal. His earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by desperation. He glanced at the crowd, at the phones capturing every move, and then back at Elijah. The Navy SEAL stood tall, unyielding. Elijah lowered his voice, but it lost none of its power. "Here's the truth, Officer Cardon," he said, his tone softening just enough to send a chill down Cardon's spine. "You didn't expect me to push back. You thought you could get away with this because you've done it before, probably more times than you can count. But not today. Today, you picked the wrong person.